as I said, thank you very much for inviting me to this first talk included in the LatinMag network. And thank you very much for the organization of this set of talks, which I'm really sure are going to be successful. Today, I'm going to briefly summarize some of our results in the magnetism of the upper mantle, which is the final result of a publication that was published recently at the end of 2020 in collaboration with other colleagues belonging mainly to the University of Lafayette, as the first author of the publication is now hired, and other colleagues from Europe and also the US. And since the talk is related to the LatinMag network, I'm going to emphasize the rock magnetic aspects, but not only, but also the other magnetic aspects of our findings. Let me see whether it's in here. It takes some time to go to the next page since I'm broadcasting. As an introduction of the topic, I'm going to historically summarize the findings that led us questioning whether the mantle is magnetic or not. And our part of the first results are dated back to the first satellite mission and the evaluation of the lithospheric residual field. As an example, here the data from POGO satellite constellation, where they already saw back in 1974 there were areas here pointed with my pointer where there were high magnetic anomalies in the lithospheric field. Those results were also found in further models in other constellations with a high resolution. And here on the next slide, you can see the very last one published in 2017 by Olsen, where most of the main anomalies are highlighted here with their corresponding names. And those anomalies, as you can see in here, for instance, in the Bangui anomaly, in the West Africa anomaly, the European Kunst anomaly, or the two anomalies in Australia, are anomalies of relatively high intensity. I say relatively because it's about 200 nanotesla, which is not a lot, but considering that this is the residual lithospheric field, are considered strong magnetic anomalies, but most importantly are very long wavelength magnetic anomalies with an extension that could be up to 300 kilometers. And those anomalies are already known for more than a century. When the satellite missions were in their high, in the 80s of the last century, when many missions were planned, the question was whether those anomalies, since they were long wavelength anomalies, were indeed based in the lower part of the crust, or even in the upper mantle, since those anomalies were belonging to the lithosphere, or they were not. Then, for the reason Vasilevsky in the more or less 1878 to 80 of the decade of the last century, measured experimentally the magnetic properties of upper mantle xenoliths. Here you can see the results of his first publication, and checking the results for magnetic hysteresis in many of those upper mantle xenoliths, the final conclusion was that they were not magnetic. The small magnetism that you can see in here were residual and was that weak that was not possible to be magnetic in the upper mantle, because at that depth these rocks were probably too hot to keep any magnetization. Therefore, the upper mantle was not magnetic. And that statement was in there for decades. And since the upper mantle was not magnetic, the inversion of the magnetic models for the lithosphere was stopped at the base of the crust. And since researchers had a good MOHO surface evaluated by all the geophysical, apologies for the word, but proxies, those type of models were kept on in the literature for decades. Then in the about 210 years, it was time to reconsider whether that assumption was real or not, with the light of new experimental techniques and also numerical approaches. And when we were considering how to approach that problem of the magnetism in the upper mantle, we realized that it was not that simple, and therefore it was not that straightforward just using upper mantle chenoliths, but also we had to use all possible methods available at that time. Among others, we decided to use either numerical analysis of magnetic anomalies that were the light that pointed out the presence of those features in the not surface but the upper part of the Earth, using again upper mantle chenoliths, but with the new instrumentation and also protocols for measuring them, and also using experimental analogs to try to simulate what was happening at high temperature and high pressure. And from now on, I'm going to explain briefly these three pieces of work that concluded finally that the upper mantle might be magnetic. When using magnetic anomalies, we were basically using mathematical methods of a potential theory. Back in 1970, Spector and Grant presented the mathematical developments to treat with this type of models. And one of the main findings was that it was, since we were using a potential theory, the solution was not unique. It's always the same problem. And since the solution was not unique, we could find high magnetization down deep, or we could have weak magnetization in the upper part. By developing the potential theory, they proposed a model in which they could try to estimate the depth of the magnetization by analyzing the spectral signal depending on the wavelength. And when checking the intensity of the spectra as a function of the wavelength or frequency or wave number, it doesn't really matter, the meaning is the same, they realized that there were changes in the slope, and those changes in the slope were related with the presence of magnetizations at different depths. And then they proposed a model that was better defined and was able to find the average depth of the magnetization by computing changes in the slope of this intensity of the spectrum. or also the normalized spectra. And by combining them both, they were able to find an average depth of the magnetization. How were they doing that? Well, essentially by choosing one point, they were computing the fast Fourier transform over the whole area and computing a mean value over a certain radius. And they were computing this procedure for different types of wavelength. With the time, researchers found that this property was not actually that linear, but was a fractal nature. And with the appearance of a newer theory, almost in the new century, it was possible to compute with a better determination the depth of the magnetization as a function of the wavelength, therefore as a function of depth. And with this type of new analysis, it was possible to determine what is named the Curie depth, that is the depth at which the magnetization is completely lost, that is the depth at which we have a temperature of about 580, which is the Curie point of magnetite, as you all know. By using this new technique, this fractal new technique, evaluation of the Curie depth, that is the depth at which magnetization, assuming that magnetization is mainly carried by magnetite, which is more or less true in large terrains, it was possible to find at continental scales that some of those magnetizations were indeed below the MOHO. This is a very nice example from the continent of Australia, in which we can see that here showing the difference between the Curie depth and the MOHO. These differences in depth can be up to 40 kilometers in some of the areas, particularly in here where, as you remember, we have one of those long wavelength magnetic anomalies in the global map. This analysis has been done in many other continents, and now it's pretty clear that magnetization, at least numerically, magnetization have to be lower than the MOHO in order to completely fit the magnetic anomalies map. Not only based on the numerical analysis of the magnetic anomalies, but also researchers recently found that there were some magnetic anomalies that were always based close to the subduction areas. In particular, I have found very nice examples also in a part of South America, but the nicer one that I found is probably here in Alaska, where it is possible to see that the magnetic anomalies are long wavelength magnetic anomalies tracing the subduction in Alaska, and the complete anomaly persists unless we also model the presence of the slab, and in that case the magnetic anomaly disappears, which means that there is also a long wavelength magnetic anomaly which is related to the presence of a cold slab that goes down, even down below the MOHO. The second piece of information that we were thinking about using is going back to the same proxy that Vasilevsky used in 1980, but taking care about the new findings on the magnetic properties of natural rocks. For that, we were using upper mantle xenoliths and analyzing the magnetic signal of upper mantle xenoliths. As you all know, xenoliths are rocks that adiabatically are uplifted in a basaltic rock, encapsulated and going up to the surface in a period of time which can be as few as some hours. That grants, that is like sampling the upper part of the mantle. And when sampling the mantle xenoliths we were using in our study, we took very well care about choosing only fresh xenoliths and avoiding what was obviously altered xenoliths. For that, not only measuring the xenolith was important, but also was a key question to develop the protocol that was granting that the magnetic properties were the pristine magnetic properties of the upper mantle. And that protocol was not only based on magnetic properties, but mainly on the origin of the signal. As a result of that, we found that there were strong evidences of permanent magnetization in those upper mantle xenoliths, summarized, for instance, in what is called in the palemagnetic discipline as the Königsberg ratio, which is showing the ratio between the induced magnetization in here and the remanence magnetization in here. When the induced magnetization, that is the magnetization that is produced by the Earth magnetic field, is as high as the remanence magnetization, then we don't have an extra magnetization of our samples. And that means that this Q ratio is below 1. However, when this Königsberg ratio is higher than 1, that means that we have a strong part of the magnetization that is due to the remanence magnetization. That is the magnetization that is fossilized or kept in the sample due to the remanence. And that is an addition to the induced magnetization. When modeling magnetic anomalies, we only check whether magnetization is induced, and we compute differences only based on the differences on magnetic susceptibility. However, if we do not include remanence magnetization in some terrains, for instance, in the presence of a magnetized oven, or in the presence of basaltic lava, or this type of rocks, we are underestimating the magnetization of our samples. This result in here proves that the magnetization is not only induced, but also some magnetic particles must be in there. This result is even stronger when we check what is named day plot or lately Day-Dunlop plot. In this type of graphical display, we compare magnetization and coercivity, but what is more important is that we can classify the domain state of our magnetic particles, considering magnetic particles as the ferromagnetic particles. In nature, everything is magnetic, but we are now talking about those ferromagnetic particles, those that are able to keep a magnetization with time. In this type of plots, when samples are close to this area SD, which is the single domain area, we are sure that magnetization is strong and lasts for a long time. While when samples are in here, magnetization is quick and it doesn't last long. Our results from upper mantle xenoliths show that magnetization is very, very close to the single domain state. Therefore, that magnetization is not only long in time, but also is very persistent. and difficult to clear. And the final evidence of a permanent magnetization in our samples was the experiment at low temperature. Magnetite, many magnetic minerals, but in particular magnetite, which is almost everywhere, magnetite has a magnetic transition, very specific, which is it changes the crystallographic structure of magnetite, and it's always present in the range of 120 K degrees, 120 Kelvin. And we see a magnetic transition at that temperature. We are almost sure that we have magnetite in the samples, and not only that we have magnetite, but we are pretty sure that what we have is pure magnetite, which is even more important because it's one of the stronger magnetic minerals on Earth. And with this final test, we proved that we had magnetite, and that magnetite was magnetized, and also this magnetization was strong and could last long in time. Also, some analysis with the electronic microscope showed the presence of magnetite within the olivine of our samples. And also part of the work was testing whether we could develop a strict magnetic protocol to ensure that, that magnetization was original from the upper mantle. And the test in that sense was checking and analyzing and including in the database only samples that had one single natural resonance magnetization direction. As we can see here on the left panel of the slide, because when samples were showing more than one magnetization, it could be clear that this magnetization could be also original, but we were not sure whether it was original or was something that was acquired when uplifting the samples up to the surface. Further tests were including coercivity spectra, either from the ARM or anisotropy resonance magnetization, including only samples with one coercivity spectrum, or one single coercivity spectrum from the IRM, including on the database only samples with one coercivity spectrum. It was unclear whether two families of magnetic populations were original or not, but suspecting that it might be due to some alteration, although it was not clear on SEM pictures, we decided to only include those over here in our database. Summarizing in the same Königsberger ratio all samples from our collection, it was obvious that some of the upper mantle xenoliths, particularly those from subduction zones, were not strong enough to keep up a magnetization, but the other samples coming from continental interiors, or sample comes, for instance, from the San Carlos collection, were strong enough to keep up magnetization. And finally, our colleagues from high pressure temperature experiments recently developed new anvil cells that allow to measure in situ magnetic properties when pressuring at high temperature and high pressure synthetic samples. And the nice thing is that when using this approach, it was clear that some magnetic properties, for instance, magnetic properties related to not only magnetite, but other magnetic phases such as hematite, were increasing dramatically the Nil temperature in the case of hematite, because it's an antiferro, were increasing dramatically the transition temperature at which magnetization is lost. And I say dramatically because you can see in here, in this plot in here, how the Nil temperature of hematite, which is 680 in Celsius, increases almost 250 degrees when it's pressure at upper mantle pressures. And that means that to us, the other phases that were not considered so far might be able to contribute to the magnetization of the upper mantle, because magnetization is lost farther depth, at lower depths. So it was necessary, it is eventually necessary to go down deep to even lower values of depth in order to lose totally magnetization. So in addition to the presence of magnetite, which is in there, and it was not obvious before, we might be able to include all the magnetic phases as sources of the magnetization at upper mantle depth. Here I show the final result, which is the phase diagram of magnetic phases in the experiment. And what is nice that from this summary is that it is important to see that this transition might occur at lower values of depth, and this is key in particular in cold scenarios. In cold scenarios such as, for instance, cratons, when the geotherm has a different gradient in these pieces of material are colder, this transition is found even down deep, even lower than before. So summarizing these three pieces of information allowed us to propose a new scenario in which some parts of the Earth, for instance, cratons, where the lithosphere is colder, might have a thicker part which is magnetic down below the moho depth, and therefore also in the upper part of the mantle, and included a part which is not exactly the mantle, because the subduction zone is essentially crust, but other areas of the Earth in which we have whole material going down to the upper mantle and creating a source of magnetization that was not considered before. Therefore, we propose that when using the lithosphere as the part of the Earth that we are going to invert in order to analyze magnetic anomalies, the depth of the magnetization must be another unknown to include in the model, and leave that free in order to have a better description of our Earth. And I think that with that, I summarize our findings of the possibilities of having also magnetism in the upper mantle. Thank you very much.